And whilst we're on the good news, one of the things that we have heard recently, you talked about the ARVs being a medical miracle. Recently, as far as it goes, when we talk about HIV treatment, we were, introduced to the world of Cabenuva. So maybe you can talk to us about Cabenuva and what that means, for HIV and also for treatment for people who are affected by the disease.
Juliette, you're even behind, actually.
I'm behind. Oh, gosh.
Antiretroviral drugs. It's not just Cabenuva, which is a very exciting development in itself. And maybe the best place to start with that story is about 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when antiretroviral drugs came into being for treating HIV. People had to take about 30 pills a day in order to treat their HIV infections. And those drugs were very toxic.
Yeah, wow.
And the treatment of HIV has evolved so that all you need now is one pill a day, and those drugs are not as toxic. There's much less toxicity now, so you can live happily
for a long
with
time.
HIV infection with just one pill a day. But Cabenuva actually takes that to another level, because now instead of taking one pill a day, you can take one injection every 2 months.
Unbelievable.
And even more recently, and this is why I'm saying that you are even out of date, is another drug, lenacapavir, which can be given once every 6 months, and it can completely prevent HIV infection. So if somebody is at risk of HIV infection and they take this drug, lenacapavir, as an injection once every 6 months, the number of new infections in a recent clinical trial was 0. Nobody who took the drug got HIV infected, despite the fact that they were exposed to HIV. So this shows you again the amazing power of biomedical science in our fight against infectious diseases such as HIV.
Hi, my name is Juliette, and I am the creator and host of Connecting the Dots podcast. I love ideas and problem solving, and my career in communications has led me down a path of curiosity. Why we do what we do, how we tell better stories, and how African scientists solve everyday problems. Join me on this enlightening and entertaining exploration of African science like you've never experienced before. Get ready to laugh, learn, and be inspired. COVID has been and will continue to dominate headlines, but before this pandemic forced us to pay attention to the virus and sanitizers, HIV created alarm and panic. Whilst with COVID, we happily bought masks and sanitizers, with HIV, our embarrassment and stigma prevented us from openly purchasing condoms. We were not finished dealing with HIV when COVID came around, and it is likely, as with the Black Plague, another virus is imminent. Award-winning scientist Professor Thumbi Ndung'u joins me to demystify all things viruses. Professor Thumbi Ndung'u is an infectious diseases researcher focused on HIV, AIDS, and TB. His work focuses on how the body's immune system fights or adapts to viruses, particularly HIV. He does this to develop vaccine. He was the first scientist to clone the HIV strain, HIV subtype C, which is the prevalent subtype in Africa, and has won many awards for his exceptional work, the most recent being the KT Jean Retroviral Award in 2023. Unless, Professor Ndung'u, there's a new one that you will tell us about shortly. Thumbu is Director for Basic and Translational Science at the African Health Research Institute in KwaZulu-Natal and a member of the ARI faculty. He is an investigator and Max Planck Institute for Infection Biology Research Group Leader. He's also a professor, chair in HIV and TB research, and scientific director at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and also the program director for the Sub-Saharan African Network for TB, HIV Research Excellence, also known as SANTHE. Professor Thumbi Ndung'u, karibu sana. We're very excited to have you here on Connecting the Dots podcast. Welcome, Thumbi.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be on.
So Thumbi, we usually begin by getting a bit of a background from our researchers and our scientists about the upbringing, their childhood stories, how they ended up in the area that they are now working with. You and your award-winning work in HIV. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, thank you very much, Juliette. I grew up in Kiambu, rural Kiambu, in a place called Githunguri.
Yep.
On a coffee farm in central Kenya. On a coffee farm, my parents were small-scale dairy and coffee farmers, and I went to primary school there, and then I went to Nyeri High School, went to the University of Nairobi, where I studied veterinary medicine, and then I ended up at Harvard University, where I did my PhD in virology.
Okay, what was it that interested you, from veterinary science to now studying viruses in the human body? Why that science discipline?
It was somewhat of an accident how I ended up studying HIV. I finished my veterinary degree and I got a job at the University of Nairobi working on a disease that affects humans. It's called bilharzia or schistosomiasis. And I worked at the University of Nairobi, and that introduced me to research. And so when I got admitted to go and do my PhD at Harvard, I went there and I found somebody who was working on HIV and was very excited about HIV as a pathogen to study. And of course, it was beginning to have a huge public health impact in Africa. And so I decided to work on HIV, and I stuck with it.
And you made an incredible discovery regarding the strains of HIV in Africa. How did you stumble upon this discovery, and how many years into your research work did it take you before you made this discovery? And what does it also mean for the continent and also HIV treatment, vaccinology?
Well, as somebody who came from rural Kenya and studied at the University of Nairobi, I actually didn't know much about HIV when I went to do my PhD. And so when I went to Harvard, it took me quite a bit of time to get to speed. And it was almost about 4 years, I remember, into my PhD when my work really started showing some positive developments. And I think through hard work and also through a stroke of luck, I was able to develop an infectious molecular clone of subtype C. And what that means is like really a cassette recording of all the genetic information that is contained in HIV subtype C. And that enabled us to then do vaccine studies as well as animal studies towards the development of a vaccine, specifically focusing on HIV subtype C. So it was a very exciting time for me. And obviously it was, very impactful research work.
And moving from Kenya to the US, what was that like for this young African boy, relocating to a developed country and then just being exposed to the facilities, the technology and a different way of working, and then moving back to the continent? We're interested in what that looked like for you and also what inspired you to move back.
I think when I first went to the US, it was a bit of a cultural shock. It was very different from what I had been grown up used to. And in fact, I remember at one time during my first year, one of my lecturers there, one of my professors told me that the reason I didn't get an A in one of the subjects was because I was too quiet in class and because I never said anything. Other than that, he thought that I was brilliant. And that taught me a lesson about engaging and how important it is to engage and interact with your peers and colleagues. And that was what I have tried to promote throughout my professional life, is this openness and curiosity and ability to ask questions and have them addressed so that you can make progress. And so when I came back to Africa, that's what I wanted to do, is to promote that sense of curiosity, that sense of asking questions. And that's what I've been doing all my life, my professional life, and I'm very glad with the trajectory that has taken.
And as you moved back onto the continent, just now going back into the HIV strain that you discovered, what did moving back mean for you in terms of now coming back to do more research on an African population and where, HIV was a big, big problem at the time? Can you just expound a little bit about that?
Well, I came back to Africa when HIV was literally devastating the continent. The numbers of cases of HIV were rising. People were dying. There was no treatment. it was a very desperate situation. And so I've been a witness to the power of biomedical science and how it can change societies, because I've seen HIV translating from a chronic infection that was almost a death sentence for everybody who got it into a chronic infection that is very easily manageable with antiretroviral drugs. And so one of the joys of my life is that I've been able to see this sea change in how we manage HIV. And again, as I say, the power of biomedical science to really change things for the better, because HIV is no longer a big public health problem as it was when I first came back to Africa more than 20 years ago to start my career after my PhD.
So Thumbi, going back to the power of biomedical science, what is it? We've seen, your work. I think a lot of the awards that you have been receiving is given to your ability, and motivation and passion to be able to mentor and bring up, train and build the capacity of young scientists to come up just immediately after yourself and be able to lead in the work of HIV vaccine development. So just expound a little bit about why do you feel that it's important to grow teams and to fundraise to be able to conduct the research that you are doing in the US and now subsequently in South Africa with other people, build their capacity to be able to do what you're doing?
Well, I think what my PhD studies and what my life has actually taught me is that Africa has tremendous potential, and we need to change Africa for the better. We need a socio-economic transformation in Africa, and we can do that through science. And so I came back with the hope that we could do that. And one of the ways to do that, one of the most powerful ways to do that, is to multiply leadership, multiply the number of leaders that we have in the continent. And the way you do that is by building young people who will take over society. And what we need is a critical mass of people, not just a few pockets of excellence, but rather we need to standardize and actualize excellence and make it an everyday occurrence in Africa. And that way we can transform society. So for me, building capacity and leadership development is really important, because that's what we need if you're going to transform Africa into a prosperous continent that all of us want it to be. And I think that science has that capability, and that's what I'm trying to do by working with young people who can be the next generation of leaders who will actualize that dream.
And Thumbi, with the young people that you're building the capacity, do you think that the HIV vaccine is far away from being discovered, or do you think that we are lucky that maybe we are nearing the discovery of the HIV vaccine?
I think we are closer to the discovery of an HIV vaccine
and why it's taken so long
have ever been.
Mm-hmm.
But HIV is a very difficult virus. And a testament to that is the fact that the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID was discovered much later than HIV. And we already have a vaccine against that virus, whereas we don't have a vaccine against HIV. HIV is genetically very complex virus, much more complex than other viruses. And so although we are closer to a vaccine, there is no guarantee that we will have a vaccine. But on the positive side, we have made a lot of progress, and there are other ways of actually stopping the virus besides a vaccine. So whereas I remain very hopeful that we'll be able to develop a vaccine, even if we don't, we have other advances in technology that are bring us much closer to the elimination of this virus. And I'm very glad about that.
And, you've touched a little bit about the HIV virus. As the general public, we hear viruses and we think they're all the same. You've said about COVID virus, for example, and we were like, yeah, but the COVID vaccine was discovered very quickly. Why is it taking scientists so many years to discover a HIV vaccine? What is it that makes this virus so difficult, to deal with? And from a biomedical standpoint, how is it different to other viruses out there, including COVID?
I think there are two things about HIV that make it incredibly difficult to work with and incredibly complex. One is the fact that in its life cycle, the virus integrates into our genomes, into the genomes of living cells. so that every time your cell divides,
It divides
you
with
have
it.
HIV, then the virus also divides. And it's very difficult to remove it from our own genetic material.
Oh, wow.
Other viruses don't do that. Other viruses generally replicate outside of our genetic makeup. And so they're easy to eliminate, and our immune systems are able to eliminate. The other problem with HIV, it's incredible genetic complexity. Its diversity is much more than any other living pathogen that we know of. And therefore, it is very difficult to make a vaccine against it because you have to be able to stop all these different genetic variants of HIV. So those two things make HIV unique and much more complex, much more difficult to deal with than other viruses that we know of.
Interesting. And can I touch a little bit on the impending? I think we're very concerned about the monkeypox. You know, is that also something else by way of viruses that we need to be more concerned about? And I think, you know, preparing also for this podcast, we read up a little bit about the alarming impact of mpox on people who already have the HIV strain, i.e. if you already have HIV, you know, and you get exposed to mpox, you suffer more than somebody who does not have HIV. So, you know, expound a little bit on that strange phenomenon, if I can call it that.
Well, the one thing I'll say about viruses, and actually, if I was speaking to my younger self,
yeah,
I would say you should be a virologist because viruses are very, very interesting, and they're always changing, and so it's an incredible area of research to go into because there'll always be excitement there. The thing about mpox is it's another different virus. It's not as complex as HIV. It doesn't mutate as quickly as HIV does. But all viruses have the capability to mutate and change. And therefore, what you see today may not necessarily be what you see tomorrow with viruses. So I don't think mpox as a virus is going to be as important from a public health point of view in terms of the number of people it impacts as HIV. And we already have a vaccine anyway against mpox. It's just that we are not able to distribute the vaccines efficiently. But I would certainly say that viruses in general are very interesting to study. And I would encourage any young person out there who is interested in science to go into virology.
We can see you advocating for young ones to start considering, you know, when you go to biomedical study to go into virology.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And tell me something, you know, with viruses, obviously we've always been talking about the negatives. Is there anything positive about viruses? Can we do without viruses on this earth?
Oh, there's a lot of positive things actually about viruses.
Oh, really?
In fact, one of the things about viruses is that because they're so good at invading our cells, we can manipulate them to deliver cargo that actually benefits us into the cells. So, for example, some of the vaccines that are being made today are made from viral vectors. So you can modify viruses so that they deliver only pieces of other viruses into the cells in a very efficient way. And that makes us make very good immune responses. And that protects us from disease without causing us to be sick from the viruses themselves. So this is why it's so interesting to study viruses, because we can actually take advantage of viruses for our own good, to do a lot of good things and not just cause diseases, but rather to benefit ourselves. So watch this space in virology. You're going to see a lot more developments coming out of virology that actually end up benefiting humanity rather than harming humanity. And this is not just for viral diseases, but also for other diseases like cancer.
Mm-hmm.
We can treat cancer in future by modifying viruses so that they deliver the kind of immune responses that we need in order to fight off a disease like cancer. So as I said, it's a very interesting branch of science, and I would like to encourage young people to go into it.
I love your analogy about, you know, the viruses acting as carriers of cargo. You know, that's going to leave an imprint on my mind for a long time coming. And whilst we're on the good news, one of the things that we have heard recently, you know, you talked about the ARVs being a medical miracle. Recently, as far as it comes, as far as it goes, when we talk about HIV treatment, we were, introduced to the world of Cabenuva. So maybe you can talk to us about Cabenuva and what that means, for HIV and also for treatment for people who are affected by the disease.
Juliette, you're even behind, actually.
I'm behind. Oh, gosh.
Antiretroviral drugs. It's not just Cabenuva, which is a very exciting development in itself. And maybe the best place to start with that story is about 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when antiretroviral drugs came into being for treating HIV. People had to take about 30 pills a day in order to treat their HIV infections. And those drugs were very toxic.
Yeah, wow.
And the treatment of HIV has evolved so that all you need now is one pill a day, and those drugs are not as toxic. There's much less toxicity now, so you can live happily
for a long
with
time.
HIV infection with just one pill a day. But Cabenuva actually takes that to another level, because now instead of taking one pill a day, you can take one injection every 2 months.
Unbelievable.
And even more recently, and this is why I'm saying that you are even out of date, is another drug, lenacapavir, which can be given once every 6 months, and it can completely prevent HIV infection. So if somebody is at risk of HIV infection and they take this drug, lenacapavir, as an injection once every 6 months, the number of new infections in a recent clinical trial was 0. Nobody who took the drug got HIV infected, despite the fact that they were exposed to HIV. So this shows you again the amazing power of biomedical science in our fight against infectious diseases such as HIV. We can completely get rid of some of these diseases through the power of biomedical science.
I mean, Thumbi, come on, all this good news and all the work that you're doing in South Africa, at what point do you get to move to Kenya so that you can also do this amazing research? Is there something that's keeping you in South Africa? Is it the infrastructure? Is it the funding from the South African government? What is it? So that, or I know maybe you are working across the continent. Does it matter where you are based?
Well, I don't want to give an excuse for not being in Kenya, but I do feel like I'm making a significant contribution even from South Africa. I run a network known as the Sub-Saharan African Network for TB and HIV Research Excellence. It's a consortium that works across 8 different African countries, including Kenya. And we collaborate with our colleagues at the Kemri Wellcome Trust. And so through this network, I'm able to actually participate in some of the exciting research work that is also going on in places like Kenya. I just happen to be based at the Africa Health Research Institute. It's my research base for now. I've got grant funding. I have students that I'm committed to. And so I'd like to definitely see this project to an end. But as I said, I can never rule out Kenya because I love Kenya, and I have colleagues in Kenya that I work with collaboratively, and maybe in future I'll work more directly there.
So I'm tempted to take you away from the viruses and ask, if you were not in virology or studying viruses, what else would you be doing in the biomedical space?
I love challenges. So cancer is malignancies and cancer are a big challenge at the moment. Because we don't have very good treatments for them, and we don't have very good diagnostics for cancers. So but most of the times, by the time people get diagnosed with cancer, it's a bit too late. So this is something that, I find also very fascinating and exciting, because I think we need to do better in terms of the way we deal with the detection of cancers, as well as the treatment of cancers. And actually even prevention of cancers itself. There's still a lot that we don't understand about what causes cancers of different kinds, how we can diagnose them better, and how we can treat them better. So there is a lot of work in that area that I also find very fascinating. And perhaps if I wasn't working in virology, that's where I would be working.
on Connecting the Dots podcast, we have been looking at the health side of things. We've really looked a lot at communicable diseases, malaria most recently with Professor Faith Osier, and now with you on the HIV. We're very interested to look at, communicable and non-communicable diseases. Do you think there's a fine balance of how these diseases are affecting us, or are we going to see an increase in non-communicable diseases, and the impact on the African population?
Well, we have already seen a huge increase in non-communicable diseases. And in fact, I think that non-communicable diseases are overtaking communicable diseases as a major public health threat.
Yeah.
If you look at things like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular infections, cardiovascular comorbidities, cancers, these are becoming major problems. And it is thought that the change in lifestyle primarily has led to the increase in a lot of these non-communicable diseases. And I expect that this is where the action will be in terms of public health action, in order for us to be able to prevent and treat these non-communicable diseases. And there's definitely an intersection, so that when people, for example, have HIV, they're much more prone to these non-communicable diseases. So people living with HIV, even when they are treated, they're still at higher risk of non-communicable diseases. So there is an interaction between these diseases that we need to understand in order for us to help us to address. I don't even want to say the coming scourge of because it is already here, the scourge of these non-communicable diseases.
And to me now, as we're hitting the conclusion of the podcast, what myths would you like to bust regarding HIV? What are your top 3 myths that you want to bust about HIV?
Well, I think the first one is the obvious one, that only people who are promiscuous get HIV.
Yeah.
Anybody can get HIV. All you need is one sexual encounter that goes wrong. So we need to realize that anybody can get HIV. We need to also realize that the epidemic is not over. The HIV epidemic is not over completely, because we still have a lot of people getting infected with HIV every day for a disease that is now preventable. So we need to redouble our efforts, I think, to eliminate HIV. And I think that one is that we have such incredibly good tools for preventing and treating HIV. Nobody should be dying of HIV today. But tools are only good if you're using them.
Right.
There's no need for having a hammer if you don't use it to hit a nail. So all these prevention and treatment technologies that we have, people need to use them so that we can keep this virus at bay.
And Thumbi, lastly, when you look at the world now, what scares you and what excites you?
I'll start with what excites me. I think what excites me is young people and their ability to be curious and not to fear, but confront challenges. That really excites me, because that's what curiosity and that enthusiasm is what will get us to the next step. That's what we need. I think, Nelson Mandela famously said that it's in our hands, and it's in our hands to change the world. If you're curious, if you're enthusiastic, and if you work hard. So I'm really excited about young people and the future. What scares me? I think what scares me is just the turmoil in the world. That is, even as we advance in technology, it's so easy to use that technology for nefarious motives, and you just need to be on social media these days, for example, to see how much negativity sometimes is generated there. And that kind of worries me, that people are not still able to come together and address problems together. But I'm more optimistic than I am pessimistic. And so I'll stick with my first answer, that I'm more excited than I am afraid of the future.
No, and I mean not to steal your words off your mouth, like the same way you've quoted Nelson Mandela. Maybe one day we will quote Professor Thumbi Ndung'u when he said, "I am more optimistic and less pessimistic." So I really like that. Your parting shot as we wind up on the podcast?
My parting shot would be for young people that there's a lot to be excited about, and the future is bright, but they need to grab the opportunities that come their way and exploit these opportunities and use the power of curiosity, ask questions, do the right thing, and we'll make this world a better place.
Professor Thumbi Ndung'u, we're very excited to watch your career unfold. Even though you've won all these many awards, I think we're very hopeful that you might just win the Nobel Prize. Who knows? I think that might be in the pipeline for you, especially given all the work that you've done. It has been very exciting to host you. For us, you are truly an inspiration. You know, just looking at your background, your career, where you've come from, where you've ended up and where you are going. It's exciting to know that, you know, you're straddling not even just the virology side of things, but just by borrowing from your own words, the power of biomedical, you know, science and the impact to the world. So wishing you well and just good luck in everything that you do. Thank you so much for your time, Prof.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots podcast, created by me, Juliette. This episode was brought to life by Mumbua and Kevin at Silent Global in Nairobi, Kenya. If you enjoyed this episode, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it, tag us, and let's keep the conversations going. Do let us know if there's any science topic that you'd want to hear about. And then join me on the next episode as I interview the next amazing African scientist here on Connecting the Dots podcast. Thank you.